when a 19-year-old woman appeared out of thin air after claiming to have just escaped from a brutal attack. The police were ready to go all in. But as they tried to get to the bottom of what happened, the twisting tale this woman tells is kind of like something you'd hear in a soap opera, or at least some sort of edgy queer teen Netflix drama. Hang on to your veggies, folks, because things are about to get real dicey. On the night of March 22nd, 2018, somewhere in rural Wisconsin, 90-year-old Don Sipple had just sat down to have some dinner when he heard a distressed knocking sound come from his front door. Don opened up the door to see a young woman in torn, stained clothes, and through her tears, she claimed that someone had just attacked her. Unsure of what happened, Don called 911 and told them that there was a young woman at his house who had been attacked and needed a doctor. He told the operators that the woman was wearing clothing that was covered in mud and other stains and appeared as if she walked to Don's house barefoot. So who the hell was this woman, and how had she gotten to Don's tiny farmhouse in the middle of nowhere? The 911 operator asked what the woman's name was, but the girl just sobbed harder and said she didn't know. On the call, which you can listen to online, you can hear this woman hysterically crying in the background and Don saying she's in pretty bad shape and they need to send someone down there real quick. Anyway, the officers had Don ask the woman if she had known who did this to her, but she was too distraught to answer and could barely get a word out, so he stopped pressing her and just stayed on the phone until help arrived. Once the cops got there, they took the woman into the back of their car and began to ask her questions, but her answers weren't very helpful and she couldn't stop crying hysterically. This girl was in bad shape. And the recordings and interviews of her, it's clear that whatever had happened was extremely traumatic because her thoughts and answers were completely scattered. And when she was talking, and she also wasn't giving the investigators anything helpful to go off of. Like when they asked her what hurts, she just responded with everything. And then they asked her who she was with or who did this to her, and she responded with, I don't know. At this point, they still had no idea who this girl was. She didn't have any wallet or ID with her, and the only thing she told them is that she's from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, but didn't know her address or how long she'd lived there. Is this starting to smell a bit fishy to anyone? I'm no expert, but as an avid true crime consumer, the fact that the woman won't give away her name or address raises some red flags for me. The only information that the cops are able to get from her is the name of the friend that they could call, Jason Mengel. And the doctors are like, well, who the heck is that? They put a pin in it and took the girl to the hospital so they could get her checked out and stabilized. As the doctors began to treat her cuts, they noticed something strange. The woman had the word boy carved into her left forearm, but that wasn't the only thing that struck them as odd. They noticed that the cuts and scratches on the woman's body were all superficial. Sure, she looked worse for wear, but not enough for her to need excessive medical treatment. And despite the fact that she said she was in an immense amount of pain, they couldn't really do much besides bandage her up. In the hospital, the woman calmed down enough to finally be able to tell them her name, Monica Carlin. Monica told the investigators that her attacker was the one who cut the word into her arm. And at this point, the detectives had even more questions than answers. So they decided to look into Monica Carlin, or at least try to. Because the first thing they found out was that Monica Carlin was no longer the woman's legal name, and that she'd actually changed it twice. Before she was Monica Carlin, she was Monica J. And actually, she wasn't even Monica Carlin anymore. She recently changed her name from Monica Carlin to Ezra McCandless. When the newly bandaged Ezra McCandless walked into the room for questioning, she was finally ready to tell her side of the story, or part of it, I should say, because she still seemed to be suffering from that post-attack amnesia. By this point, the police had also gotten reports of a 24-year-old guy named Alex Woodworth who'd gone missing in that area, and it seemed the pieces were starting to emerge from an ever-growing puzzle. There was an alleged victim of an attack. Ezra's car was nowhere to be found, and there was a missing guy named Alex. And then officials found out that Alex was Ezra's ongoing, off-again, on-again boyfriend that was last seen with Ezra on the day he went missing. Yes. Those on-again, off-again relationships you always hear about that just make you go, that sounds like, I don't know, healthy? Even healthier, the police had actually been called to check on a domestic disturbance just a few hours earlier at Alex's house that very same day when Ezra had been over. Yet, of course, Ezra maintained that she still had no recollection of the night before and didn't know where Alex or her car was. Throughout questioning, Ezra said her memory blacked out whenever she tried to remember that night, and initially in the investigation, the officers assumed since her car was missing that Alex attacked her and then just drove off with her car. But they were about to find out that this case was not going to be that simple. And boy, were their cabbage heads about to roll. Because Ezra wouldn't give them any help as to what happened the hours before she showed up to Don Sipple's doorstep. They decided to push in a different direction and asked about the first person's name she said on March 22nd, after she claimed she'd been attacked by Jason Mengal. Remember this guy? Just roll with me. It's all coming together in a second. Let's grab some coffee. Racy's Coffee Shop was this hipster, Instagram-worthy coffee shop that was always popping with the local teens and university students. Ezra, being a free-spirited artist who wanted to meet more intellectual minds, was often found seated in one of the overstuffed vintage armchairs. You can see it in your head, can't you? Every town has their version of Racy's. Racy is also where she met her now ex-boyfriend, Jason Mengal. So Jason Mengal was this very interesting character. He was a medic in the army. He liked to wear those flat newsboy caps and apparently rode his bike everywhere he went. Total hipster. Like, let me shadow that for you real quick, because Jason was 33 years old. In August 2017, Jason and Ezra started officially dating when Ezra was only 19. I don't care if it's technically legal, it still gives me shivers. Like, 14-year age gap? Yeesh. Jason swore he initially didn't know how big the age gap was and said she spoke like she was much older than she actually was. And as the detectives interviewed Jason, they got to know Ezra a little bit better. Ezra McCandless was a person who really struggled with her identity growing up. She told the investigators she questioned her gender at times, and as well as her sexual identity, and often felt like she didn't fit in with any group. She said in high school she dressed more masculine and described her gender as fluid, but that nowadays she embraced her feminine side and used she/her pronouns. This theme of identity crisis would continue throughout her life when Monica Carlin decided to change her name to Ezra McCandless, before she was even a legal adult. Why this name? She explained Ezra because she wanted a more androgynous, unisex-sounding name, and McCandless after Christopher McCandless. Yes, the into the wild, abandon everything to live in an Alaskan wilderness and eventually die guy. Ezra and Jason had moved in together after a few months of dating, but they'd hit a rough patch in the relationship around 2017. And around that time, Ezra met Alex Woodworth. Alex was this 20-something-year-old guy who she'd seen at her local bar, often hunched over, scribbled in a notebook. So one night, Ezra decided to approach him and strike up a conversation, and thus began their secret and complicated relationship. Alex was in the process of getting his PhD in philosophy and worked as a barista at Racy's to pay for school, because that's what it takes if you want a higher education these days. According to Ezra, Alex was a troubled soul and carried around notebooks of his journaled thoughts on life and darker things. Just like Ezra, Alex was someone who struggled with his sexual identity as well as depression, which he told Jason about whenever he had a little too much at the bar. Yeah, you heard that right. Alex and Jason were friends, while Ezra was secretly dating Alex behind Jason's back. All three of them actually were really close friends. Eventually the secret got out and Jason broke up with Ezra, which resulted in Ezra breaking up with Alex, or something of that sort. But apparently all three remained friends. Different people claimed different things. Different sources said different things, but essentially everyone was single in the end. Like I said earlier, we are dealing with a lot of healthy relationships here. So let's fast forward to the morning of March 22nd when Ezra said she had returned some items to both of her exes that day and picked up some of her things from them. Here's the general timeline of what investigators think happened on that night. First, Ezra went to Racy's and exchanged stuff with Jason. Then she told him she was going to Alex's place next. Ezra drove to Alex's house and parked in his driveway. She left the car running because she thought that it wouldn't take that long. Alex asked her upstairs to talk, so the two went upstairs. Meanwhile, Jason said he had a bad gut feeling, so he decided to ride by Alex's place to make sure that everything was okay. Jason saw that Ezra's car was parked in the driveway, still running, and was like, oh shit. During all of this, someone nearby got suspicious of the idling car and the man, Jason, who had been pacing across the street, and they called the cops. Just before Jason could pedal on his merry way, he was stopped in his tracks by some officers responding to a domestic disturbance call. When the three were told neighbors had heard raised voices, they acted confused and said they had no idea what they were talking about, and there hadn't been a disturbance. Ezra said her and Alex decided to take a drive, and then everything went fuzzy. As soon as Ezra said this, the cops immediately perked up. By this point in the investigation, Ezra had been in and out of hospitals and holding cells, and she had no idea that the lifeless body of Alex Woodworth had been discovered hanging halfway out of the back of her abandoned car. Afraid she would clam up again, the police strategically began to press Ezra for more and more details about the car ride. But of course the amnesia came back, and she could only say she remembered she felt really scared, and then showed up at Dawn's house. Does anyone else find it convenient how every time we might potentially hear some incriminating evidence, suddenly Ezra can't remember anything? Now, eventually they asked her if Alex attacked her. She told them yes, and she said she was afraid for her life. They asked who carved the word boy into her arm, and she told them that Alex did. Officials were still super confused, so Ezra explained to them her history with her gender identity and how she used to identify as male in high school. She claimed Alex wanted her to be a boy in their relationship and would sometimes refer to her as such. The cops had been suspicious that Ezra had not told the full truth during the investigation, and now they knew that they'd finally caught her in a lie. Based on the placement of the word on her arm and that it was facing towards her, they knew she was the only one who could have carved the word at that angle into her arm. So the cops were like, oh, really? He carved it upside down into your arm while he was driving the car? And you can literally see Ezra implode on herself as she realized what she had just done. The investigators knew it was showtime, baby, and it was time to go all out. They tell her they walked down the road from Dawn Sipple's house until they found a set of footprints leading to her car. And they're like, well, what happened, Ezra? Suddenly, the fog lifted, and Ezra could remember what happened. Ezra said that Alex got mad all of a sudden and threw her in the back of the car and just started grabbing and attacking her. She said he cut her clothes with a blade, so she said she got the blade from him and started defending herself as fast as she could. Despite this statement, Alex's wounds were found to be far worse than Ezra's. Autopsy reports showed that the blade pierced Alex 16 times, and he was found to have cuts on his brain, lung, amongst other areas. Because Alex couldn't tell his side of the story, the experts had to look at the forensic evidence to try to piece together a more accurate picture of actually what happened. Experts described the attack on Alex as an act of pure rage as opposed to self-defense, and they had a theory that it was premeditated by Ezra, who blamed Alex for the end of their relationship with Jason. But was Ezra this cold, calculated villain who acted out of pure rage? Or was she really the defenseless victim of a random attack of a young, troubled man? In court, Ezra changed her story to say that Alex's attack was sexually motivated, but by the sheer brutality of the puncture marks shown in the forensic pathologist's testimony to the jury, it was clear that this was not a matter of self-defense but an act of anger. The jury also heard that Alex's cell phone and the weapon had been dropped and later found along the highway as Ezra's way of trying to dispose of evidence, as well as the fact that Ezra's wounds were self-inflicted, including the word boy on her arm, which she admitted she had done herself when they caught her in the lie of it facing the wrong way. Yeah, this girl was really starting to not look good up there. Ezra initially tried to plead not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, but later pleaded not guilty. During her trial, her jury did not find her to be believable or even likable for that matter. When the judge sentenced her, he told her he never saw the slight bit of remorse for what she had done or for Alex. The jury believes she planned it from the very start, and Ezra McCandless was found guilty in the first degree, and on February 7, 2020, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 50 years. She currently sits in a correctional facility in Wisconsin, and like a lot of other inmates we've covered, she also sells her art on Instagram pages to raise funds for her appeals. Obviously, I always want to believe the victim in this case, but what do you do when the attacker also claims to be the victim? As far as I'm concerned, everyone was a victim in this case, and no one came out on top. Well, maybe we did, since we've got these delicious cabbage rolls to dig into. Thank you so much for watching, and we really appreciate it.